Morning. And welcome to the beautiful Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. And I want to thank Rich Reyes Gavlin and the DCPL team for having us again today. Give them a round of applause. I also want to welcome Chairman Mendelson and the members of the council. I think it's our turn to host the Mayor Council Breakfast, which most people are accustomed to seeing us in a very, very small room in the John A. Wilson building. And we think it's nice to be here in the beautiful Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. But the goal is the same, to discuss topics of interest to the mayor and council, and to invite, from our point of view, featured guests that are speaking on important topics affecting the District of Columbia. But before I begin, I wanted to recognize a wonderful life of a Washingtonian, Miss Vanilla Bean. Miss Bean's family announced yesterday that she passed away at 103 years old. We were blessed to have Miss Bean in our community, and I certainly was blessed to call her a friend. And most recently, we recognized her just a couple of weeks ago at the Mayor's Arts Award. So Miss Bean lived until she died. And may we all be so lucky and blessed. So keep Miss Bean's family in your prayers in the Ward 4 community, certainly as well. Vanilla Bean was a class act. I also want to announce 3 appointments, well, there you have it. Anita Cozart, many of you have known for many years as a planner for the District of Columbia, and Anita has been acting as the director of the Office of Planning. She has done an amazing job. She recently co-chaired our Black Home Ownership Strike Force, which helped me set the goal of 20,000 Black homeowners by 2030. She has also completed 3 small area plans and has had the participation of more than 4,500 DC residents. So please join me in congratulating Anita on her appointment. I am also appointing Nin Kine to serve as the director of the Office of Human Rights. Nin has led OHR as well in an interim capacity for the last several months. And in addition to leading the organization's operations, she has navigated the influx of cases related to COVID-19. Director Kang is a seasoned civil rights attorney with more than 14 years of experience, a deep understanding of the human rights law, and a commitment to keeping stakeholders engaged in this very important work. So please join me in congratulating Nin on her appointment. I am also appointing Eduardo Perdomo as the director of the Mayor's Office on Latino Affairs. Director Perdomo has led the office in the last several months, and he has overseen the very successful lineup of Hispanic Heritage Month events. He has introduced new events such as the Afro-Latino Festival in Washington, D.C., which was held in Ward 1. And he has played a key role in addressing the humanitarian crisis in our city over the last several months. I want, please join me in congratulating Eduardo on his appointment. And I know it's October, but we would appreciate the approval of the appointments of Anita and Nin this session, if possible. So I want to thank the council members in advance for your attention to their appointments. I also want to highlight that we're hiring as a city, and I want to use this moment to invite more DC residents to join our team at DC government. I mentioned the Black Home Ownership Strike Force, and we had an event earlier this month to release that report. And we heard from one of our employees, Brittany Freeman, a D.C. government employee and lifelong D.C. resident. Brittany grew up in transitional housing, and she has taken advantage not only of a good D.C. government job, but all of the programs and services that will allow our employees to buy their homes, like HPAP and EHAP. So Brittany went from a renter to a homeowner, but more than that, she really changed the trajectory of her life. And so we know that is the path for many residents. I frequently say that we're 37,000 public servants at the service of D.C. residents, and in the face of unprecedented challenges, our employees have stepped up to the plate. And many of them are doing more work than they did 3 years ago because we have many vacancies to fill. So with that, please share among your networks and friends that DC government is hiring, and you can go to careers.dc.gov, or you can go to moda.dc.gov to find appointed positions in agency leadership and policy positions. So that's what I have to say at this point, Mr. Chairman, and I know that you all are looking forward to hearing from Elliot Ferguson, who is the Director of Destination DC, which does critical work for the district in making sure that our visitors are finding us, and when they find us, they have great hotel accommodations, great events, and enjoy their experience in D.C. We will also hear from members of our public safety team, including Chief Conti, Director Harley Harper, as well as Director Hunter on our status. We're going to ask them to provide what I call a situational update on public safety. And we look forward to hearing from the council, the next Mayor Council breakfast, on priorities that you feel important for the city. So with that, Mr. Chairman, let me turn to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Good morning. Good morning to everyone. First, I want to note that all but two of the council members are here because we recognize the importance of these gatherings, and I want to also give you credit for the fact that we're doing this. You brought this up to me a couple months ago and said you think it's time that we started doing these Mayor Council breakfasts again. It's important that we have the lines of communication open between the two branches, so I want to thank you for that and taking the initiative here. I also want to just note that it's not too often that we've been doing these events over the last couple of years, and sometimes I feel like we're moving awfully slowly, not just, I don't mean the government, but I mean as a city and as a society, to reopening. And I think folks want to see us reopen and get back to normal, and so having this today is part of that, and I want to thank you for that. I'm not going to be very long in my remarks. In fact, I'm going to be very brief. Members asked that there be a briefing on public safety, and so I'm glad that we're doing that. There is a lot of concern among members and citizens across the district with regard to public safety, and we can talk about the numbers, and if I remember most recently, the incidence of violent crime compared to a year ago at this time is down slightly, but that's not the way a lot of residents feel, and so this conversation is important. And I'm looking forward to the discussion that we have there. I don't want to get in the way of the presentation, so I want to again thank you and look forward to the conversations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let me turn now to Elliot Ferguson, as I mentioned, the President and CEO of Destination DC. And Elliot I may have, I think, talked to a number of you about Destinations DC's work and what we need to ensure the comeback of our hospitality sector. So, Elliot, please.
All right, Madam Mayor and members of the council, good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be in front of you. I know it's been since March 2020 since you've last met in person, so it's my pleasure to be able to share with you some things specific to tourism and hospitality. This morning I'm joined with a series of dignitaries from the hospitality industry, including our board chair, Ron Bracco with Hargrove Incorporated, Meet Atkinson, the general manager of the New Royal Sonesta Hotel and chairman of the board of the Hotel Association, Solomon Key, president and CEO of the Hotel Association, Kevin Clinton, COO of Federal City Council, Greg Staley, VP of Communications with the U.S. Travel Association. Last but not least, Robin McLean, our Senior VP of Marketing and Communications at Destination DC. And we want to spend some time sharing with you some of the results and things that are happening within the hospitality industry, and equally as important, what we should be focusing on moving forward. The key things is that as we're looking at the pandemic and the economic impact of the pandemic, what we've seen, of course, would be less visitors, less taxes generated, and an opportunity for us to focus on economic development for, quite frankly, all wards of the city. As we look at where we are as a destination, you can see that as I go through the slides, there's also a copy of the presentation in front of you as well, if it's easier for you to share, to go through that. Just to give you a snapshot of where we were in 2019, we had 10 years of strong visitation in the city and 10 years of strong economic impact with nearly $900 million in taxes generated and 78,000 plus jobs for the industry overall. What's happened, of course, like so many other industries, is that, of course, COVID had a negative impact on our industry as a whole. As we looked at what happened in the beginning, March of 2020, we were the first industry that really stopped doing events and activities, and we've unfortunately been the last to rebound. The bottom line for us is that we've been losing market share in so many different areas, while from a global perspective, the pandemic has had a negative impact on tourism. On the other hand, some other destinations, such as Florida and other cities, have really, quite frankly, and states have seen record attendance and record visitation, mostly those beach destinations, park destinations, and places like Puerto Rico, whereas they basically referenced they had the strongest year ever in 2021. So what that means for Washington is that occupancy, which is a key indicator for us, is still down in terms of visitation into the city. And with occupancy, that's, of course, the number of rooms that are actually occupied in hotels. The other indicator, average daily room rate, ADR, is also down. So those levels compared to 2019 have continued to put us behind a lot of the competition. What you see on the slide and in front of you would be basically how we're positioned versus other cities. Equally as much as we're looking at recovery, we saw more visitation in Washington this year than we saw in past years, but as we look at some of the key other indicators, revenue per average room rate, average daily room rate, those things continue to remain down as a whole. So yes, we saw more people in the city, but more doesn't always mean the same thing in every bucket. Now, as a reminder, as the mayor referenced, I represent Destination DC. I've been with the organization for 21 years. We're a private nonprofit organization. We have 1,000 members. We work closely with the city, and we work, of course, closely with Events DC, the Restaurant Association, and the Hotel Association in terms of focusing on what we do, including the return on investment, which we do in tandem with the CFO's office on a regular basis. The key things for us is how do we continue to bring more visitors to the city? How do we have a larger economic impact and more jobs created? And we do that through a series of things. Marketing, you've seen billboards. If you visited other cities, you won't see a lot of marketing on DC in DC, but if you visit other destinations, you'll see a lot of the marketing in which we do on a regular basis, as you see on the screen, one of the billboards that is currently up in Philadelphia. The goal for us is to focus on how we market Washington as a destination and the Experience DC campaign, which is a continuation of the DC Cool campaign. When I talk to stakeholders on a regular basis, the question is, how are we doing? Doesn't everybody want to come to Washington? And the reality is, as you look at competitive city budgets, cities like New York, Chicago, and other key cities continue to outspend us. Plus, they have state organizations that play an active role in promoting their destinations as a whole. You have us. So you have our budget. As you look at the screen, you'll see that we're at the very bottom in terms of the overall spend in terms of going after those important visitors. That was before the pandemic, and now, especially with the pandemic, we're continuously focusing on bringing visitors to the city. There are two types of visitors, those that stay longer and spend more, and then everyone else. So as we've been seeing visitation in the city over the last couple years, you've seen a larger number of domestic visitors coming to Washington. But as you see on the screen, the domestic visitor return on investment is grossly behind what the international visitors' economic impact is. So one of our goals is, as we look at only 7% of international visitors coming to Washington, we want that number to grow, but equally as much as you look at the markets such as China, each Chinese visitor spends $10,000 plus compared to roughly $600 that a domestic visitor spends. So we're going after those key markets and finding ways to do that. One of the big questions that's asked of us on a regular basis is how we're funded. There is a hotel tax, 14.95%, as you see on the screen and in your presentation, that exists. As an organization, as you look at that very convoluted profile on the screen, you see that we get about 1% or less than 1% of the occupancy tax that is a part of our budget. So that's 80% of my budget, whereas the other 20% is tied to our membership, partnerships, and other opportunities that we have in place. So the key thing for us is, as the mayor has done and the city council has done in giving us additional dollars to promote Washington, Events DC has done the same thing. We have an opportunity to really focus on ways to bring more visitors back to the city, especially the international visitor. So what I'm talking to you about today is a tourism recovery district. This is being done in quite a few cities. It's a stable source of funding for us that's above and beyond the lodging tax, the hotel tax that visitors spend or pay when they physically come into the city and stay in a hotel. We don't benefit from any other tax other than the hotel tax, so the Tourism Recovery District will be an opportunity to focus on opportunities to really bring more economic development to the city. Most cities have tourism improvement districts that exist in perpetuity, even though they're rebounded or they're evaluated every 3 to 4 years. What we're looking at is a 3 to 4 tourism recovery district, which gives us a chance to focus on lift. 2.1% increase in visitation to the city and a 4.5% increase in revenues to the city. Now, the key thing is for us is that we're very sensitive about taxes as a whole, especially for visitors. We want to remain competitive, but we also want to bring more visitors to the city. And with that, there is always the question of what do you do with the money and how is it measured? Fortunately, with Glenn Lee's office, we work with an independent organization that does a return on investment study every single year to focus on how we're doing as it pertains to our marketing efforts. And that's important to us and important to you as we're looking at this tourism recovery district, which would be a short-term temporary opportunity for us. What it would do for us is it would raise approximately $20.7 million estimated in additional revenue that we would be using solely to market DC, to domestic, and especially to international markets. That would increase our budget from about $25.1 million to about $45.8 million, with it being used solely and primarily for marketing and domestic advertising, international markets, growing media, and conventions, of course, as well. So these buckets are all important to us, important to the convention center, as we're looking at the larger congresses as well as smaller meetings meeting in the convention center. So each of those buckets are a part of what we focus on a regular basis, and that ties to more people eating in restaurants and more economic development as a whole. So the marketing, as you see on the screen, would be primarily, as I said, focusing on international and domestic marketing. As you see, over 20 million of it would be focusing on ways in which we go after those markets. We have representation in 4 different countries. Our goal is to increase that representation because as we look at our competition, they have representation in several countries. So as we're looking at the rebound of this market, there's an opportunity for us to really do more and bring additional folks to the city. And the ROI study reemphasizes that we do on a regular basis. So be it domestic marketing, international marketing, meetings and conventions, all of these things have key performance measures that are in place that really focuses on how well we're doing. Clearly, if we're bringing the conventions to the city, it's obvious because we see the visitors in our city like we did last week with Infectious Disease Society. But equally as much, how impactful is the marketing or the sales effort? So there are ROI studies that focus on the marketing, the occupancy, the average daily room rate, and all areas that are tied to measuring our productivity. And I think the bottom line for us, as we've done this with the CFO's office for years, is that for every dollar we spend on promoting our destination, there's a $3 return on investment. What you see in a lot of other cities is that they're saying there's a $10 to $15 return on investment. But we're very sensitive and very clean in terms of what we're suggesting, that if we invest $20 million in marketing Washington, there'll be a $60 million return on investment that city managers and city leaders will have to really focus on key areas of Washington, D.C. as a whole. So as a resident of Washington, clearly for me, as I'm looking at ways in which we can increase revenue to the city, we are looking at ways in which we can focus those revenues tied to visitors coming to the city. This again will be an assessment of about 1%, in which we're suggesting for 3 to 4 years, in which visitors will pay, and then after that time frame, the assessment would sunset. And then what we would do is continue to focus on measuring the return on investment of those dollars, which will give us a chance to remain competitive against other cities, not only domestically, but globally, as we're looking at rebounding as a destination. So some of the questions that have been asked of me in terms of what we're doing as we're looking at this as an assessment is the Hotel Association in agreement with what we're doing? Now, clearly, we're always focusing on ways to make sure that we don't position ourselves whereas we're not competitive, and that's why this is short term. And I'm happy that Meade and Solomon are here with us today representing the Hotel Association, because this is something that the hotels would have agreed to do upon themselves in terms of this assessment that will give us the dollars to be more effective in marketing Washington. The oversight will be the Hotel Association, our board of directors, Events DC. Of course, we present twice a year to the City Council in terms of our productivity, as well as other key stakeholders within the community. So with that, I'm going to ask Meade with the Hotel Association to maybe say a few words, followed by our board chair as well.
Thank you, Elliot. I'm Meade Atkinson.
Meade, you need the microphone.
Sorry.
My name is Meade Atkinson. I'm the chair of the Hotel Association, and I'm with Sonesta Hotels right now. We have had several meetings with hoteliers, and we feel that this is a home run. For years, we've had a hard time competing against some of the other big cities because of resources, and we have a lot of confidence in Destination DC. We believe that this is what we need to pull DC out of the pandemic situation that we're in right now. We feel that it's something that we have some control over, and we are very pleased that it's an assessment that sunsets maybe 3 to 4 years or so.
Thanks very much. In addition to me, we've worked really closely with Brand USA that focuses on marketing the U.S. globally, and the U.S. Travel Association that focuses on the health of the industry as a whole. And so I've asked Greg Staley, the Vice President of Communications, to also give you a footprint from the U.S. Travel's perspective in terms of the importance of having these dollars in place for marketing. So, Greg?
Good morning. Thank you, Elliot. The U.S. Travel Association is proud to be based right here in Washington, D.C. And just wanted to make a couple of key points from the association. One, as travel returns, competition for these travelers is fierce. And cities with whom D.C. actively competes have recently increased their investment to attract a growing number of travelers. Travel is coming back, but that competition is fierce. As tourism marketing programs work, they result in increased demand for your hotel product, for your restaurants, for your retailers. However, there are barriers that still persist, unfortunately, particularly with international travel and business travel. Advancing the investment that Elliot has proposed, we believe is a smart step. It's a creative step. It will help you to attract global travelers and domestic travelers, and the U.S. Travel Association encourages you to proceed.
Thank you, sir. So before I ask my board chair to come up, I absolutely want to pause and entertain any questions with Robin McLean, our Senior VP of Marketing and Communications, in terms of what we're presenting.
Mr. Chairman, we'll turn to you for questions.
I'm sorry, is she going to speak, or Are we
Robin
open for questions?
Robin and Elliot, I think, are going to answer questions.
Right, we're going to answer any questions you all may have in the last.
I think Elliot wants Robin to answer all the tough ones.
That's a good strategy. That's leadership. I'm going to start with a question. And my question is this: how do you trust us that we will sunset this?
Trust. Well, I think the bottom line is that the hotels themselves are suggesting that we put this in place for 4 years. The bottom line for us is that we want these dollars to remain competitive, but we want the hotels, I'm speaking on behalf of the Hotel Association, who will either agree with me or not, really want to make sure that if they assess themselves, it would be used solely for marketing the destination. So after a 3 to 4 year period, if there is an appetite to continue something along these lines that could be used solely for marketing, that probably could be entertained. I would like to think that we would trust you all to really focus on the return on investment. So the ROI study that we do at the CFO's office says if you invest in the front end, you'll have more on the back end.
Let me turn to colleagues. Councilmember Henderson, then Pinto, then White.
Okay, great. Thank you for your presentation. I have to say I'm a little skeptical, only because for years the Hotel Association has said that the price of our hotel rooms was out of bounds with the rest of the region. And so I know you're calling it an assessment, but you're asking us to add 1% to the hotel tax. How will that impact visitors in terms of costs in comparison to the rest of the region?
Absolutely, and I'll start by answering it, and if the Hotel Association wants to add any comments, I will let them. DC is not the cheapest destination as a first-tier destination, and we never attest that we are. I think what you're referring to is, does the tax allow us the 14.95% with the 1% assessment, does that position us to not be as competitive? We're not going to be at the top of the food chain in terms of hotel taxes. So right now, as we look at top first-tier destinations, we're probably number 8. We should be very concerned, and as you all should be, and the Hotel Association should be, because as we look at tax structures in other cities, they're not necessarily positioned in terms of the demand that a city like Washington, D.C. does. As I said to the mayor and to the CFO and to so many others, the deputy mayor, we're not going to position ourselves as an organization where we're not going to be able to remain competitive. So it's not in my best interest to position us in a way whereas we would have business not come to Washington. That's basically career suicide. So, we still feel very confident that we will still remain competitive as we're looking at bringing those groups to the city and bringing visitors to the city. People that stay in the suburbs, especially during peak months, stay in the suburbs because people pay higher rates to stay in D.C. And as I say to folks all the time when groups are saying, well, why are room rates so high? Because people pay those rates. And I think the key thing for us is to focus on our marketing in a way whereas as you're looking at the transportation costs and other costs associated with coming back and forth to D.C., that they'll see that staying in a property in D.C. makes the most sense. But the easiest answer to that is that as an organization that solely focuses on marketing DC, I would not position us in a way where we would not be able to remain competitive. And if you need additional, okay. Sure.
Good morning, everyone. Solomon King, Hotel Association. It's great to see all of you today. It's good to see that our messaging got through on that. One of the very technical reasons why this is different, one, because as we start to see other cities and destinations that we compete against, they're doing the same thing. So everyone is going to have a slight uptick. But we're also counting and relying on that sunset, because as others sunset and go down, we still don't want to be hanging up there as an outlier. We have all the faith in the world in Destination DC, Elliot and his team. We know that we can get this done, but we simply can no longer afford to be outspent by destinations that we compete directly against for group and leisure travel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Pinto.
Thank you all very much. Continuing on that train of thought around concern for competitiveness in the region. It sounds like a lot of the analysis is based on the other top 8 markets throughout the country and remaining competitive with them. But what about remaining competitive with choices so close, like Virginia and Maryland, particularly for visitors who already have made the choice to come to Washington, D.C. for their events, conventions, visits, but are opting to stay in Maryland and Virginia because the costs of the rooms are oftentimes cheaper there? Will this harm that sector?
We don't believe so. We think it gives us the competitive advantage in those circumstances because we can make the case for why Washington, D.C. better. So it is about the walkability. It's about the experiences. If you're staying outside of the district, you're not experiencing the city in the same way. Often people come, stay outside of the city, and think because there are conferences in D.C. or the D.C. area that they're experiencing it in a very particular way, and then they don't have that experience when they come. And so it allows us to get ahead of that, even on the meetings and convention side. So it allows us to sell, make that case on the front end, and win business to bring that business to D.C.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of your current budget, how are you evaluating the efficacy of the dollars that you are spending? I know you mentioned that for every dollar spent, you believe there's about a $3 return on investment. What are some of those metrics that go into measuring that?
Yeah, the key thing for us, and I'll let Robin finish it, is that there's an external organization, Tourism Economics, that measures this. What we've done is, as Mr. Lee has come into Washington, D.C., we've worked with the CFO's office because we never want to position ourselves where someone says that, sure, Elliot's going to say that there's a return on investment. It's done with an external organization that looks specifically at marketing campaigns in which we do, and they tie it into the effectiveness of those campaigns, doing research with individuals that are physically in the city to find out how they heard about Washington as a destination, and other variables associated with it. And it's a very detailed study that's done every single year based on campaigns. As we look at the international market, it's much easier. As the mayor and other stakeholders have traveled with us to China in the past, most visitation done by the international community is done through travel agents. A good example, C-Trip, an organization that has about 35,000 employees. They're responsible for planning vacations and travel for most of the visitors that are leaving China and going to other destinations. So with the representation that we have in other cities, they're able to tell us exactly what who they're attracting or appealing to come to Washington, D.C. based on those individual bookings. So, and I'll also say that as we look at, to the Councilman Member Henderson, as we look at tourism improvement districts, we're looking at a tourism recovery district. I referenced that other cities have these things in place. I started looking at the other top cities, LA, San Francisco, Miami, New York, Hawaii, Las Vegas, and Orlando, as we're in that mix of the top 10 destinations. Every one of those cities except for Miami and Hawaii have tourism improvement districts. So in addition to the hotel tax, they're paying a tourism improvement district tax, that assessment that exists on top of their bill. And if you're going to a place like Miami, the reason why they don't do it is because you're paying a resort fee. So you see all the different variables. The key thing for us is that there is a sunset, to Chairman Mendelson's point, that we expect to happen at a point, at some point along the way. But we also see an opportunity for us to really get back on point with bringing additional visitors to the city.
Thank you. We need to be moving along because I think there are 8 council members in line. Thank you. Councilmember Trayon White.
Thank you. I think outside of the competition from Maryland and Virginia, we had a fire at a senior home in Navy Yard last week, Chief, you know about that. And we had to relocate some residents, and normally Red Cross give them a voucher, put them in a hotel. This time it was different because the hotel was about $400 a night, which soaked up a lot of their voucher, and one of the residents came back. I think the conversation wasn't much so about hotels at that point, was about the competitive nature of Airbnb. How do you foresee this playing a part in losing market share to Airbnbs versus hotels?
You know, there's such a, most travelers, and we didn't talk specifically about the types of travelers that we're attracting, like business travelers, they're not staying in Airbnbs. A large portion of the visiting population, there's a percentage of people that like staying in Airbnbs, and then everybody else wants their points. So as we're looking at the impact of a disruptor like Airbnb, they have not necessarily been as disruptive as the concern was in the beginning. And, you know, speaking specifically to some of the legislation that's been put in place in regards to Airbnbs, they're not necessarily as many as there were before. So the bottom line for us, because Airbnbs still pay the hotel tax, if they have a choice between staying in Virginia and staying in Airbnb in D.C., I'd rather them stay at an Airbnb in D.C. than stay in Virginia, because we don't benefit from that visitor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Robert White.
Thank you so much for the presentation, for the work and coordination that you all are doing. Obviously, it's incredibly important that we recover in a way that's going to be sustainable in lifting our economy. But I also know that this won't be the only recovery effort we make. And so I want to know what you foresee as the timing for this to go into effect, because I worry that it might not be coordinated with other efforts coming from the administration, the council, or other industries.
I can jump in. So we've been working with Destination DC on legislation which would enable this. So we're trying to work with the CFO's office to see how soon it could be. For the Destination DC, and Ellie can speak to this, the sooner the better, but we also want to make sure it could be set up administratively. So I think there's a little bit of work that we're doing on the back end to figure out how soon it could be implemented.
Okay, thank you. What did our tourism numbers look like prior to COVID? Were they increasing, decreasing?
For the last 10 years, they have been increasing. From 2009 to 2019, we saw 10 years of incremental increase. Now keep in mind, from 2001 to 2011, it took us about 10 years to rebound post 9/11, which is when I moved to DC, December 2001. So every single year, we were seeing year-over-year increases in numbers. And keep in mind, as we look at the numbers, we're still looking at who's coming and who's spending the most. So I want everyone to come, including student youth travel, but at the same time, the goal, one of the key initiatives of our board, of all of our stakeholders, is how do we get visitors that are coming and that are going to stay longer and spend more, and how do we attract group business, corporate business, and other groups that will come into the city. The association, the exhibitors, and the attendees will also spend more money. So though we want everyone to come, and right now it's like, hey, anything and everyone we can come that will come into the city as we're recovering from the pandemic, we still want to see incremental increases in numbers, but we equally as much want to see incremental increases in spend. At the end of the day, if we have, let's say we have 10 million additional visitors, then we'll be sitting in front of you and you all will be saying how folks are talking about additional traffic and other causes associated with larger numbers of individuals. So we're trying to make sure that the tide rises in both areas.
I appreciate it. And finally, advertising isn't the only factor. So compared to jurisdictions like Philly, Boston, or Atlanta, which were on your list, other than advertising, what are the reasons folks are going there as opposed to DC?
Cities like, well, it's usually infrastructure. Our convention center, I moved here from Atlanta. The building, the convention center was 900 square feet. When I left, it's 1.5 million now. Our building is 700,000 square feet. The demand for Washington still remains strong, but we can't book what we can't host. So the bottom line for us is that as we're looking at the attractiveness of DC as a destination, we still remain a very favorable destination in terms of getting into the city. When the Silver Line opens in my lifetime and all these other variables, I should have said that. But these things are important to visitors, especially international visitors, compared to some of the other cities. So the attractiveness of a city like Washington is more comparable to a city like Boston as we look at competing. And they have 2 convention centers. So usually for us, it's an infrastructure issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Councilmember Bonds.
Thank you very much, Chairman. My question, Robert kind of touched on my question. I was very curious in looking at the data and noting that it seems that Atlanta spends far less And I'm wondering, does this chart tell us that Atlanta spends less and therefore is getting more bang for the buck? And I was curious about that. And I have a second question, so
Sure.
I'll go with that.
Okay. The answer to that question is that the thing about a city like Atlanta, and I'm glad you're choosing them because, again, I moved here from there, is that their industry is solely tied to the business, to conventions, whereas we're going after leisure market and the convention market. They are going after the leisure market as well, but arguably they don't have the same product. So as we're going after the international market, what you should be looking at are cities like Los Angeles, cities like New York, San Francisco, whereas those cities have 40% of their visitation is international. We're still wanting those numbers, and with that, you see a larger spend tied to going after those visitors. As you look at a city like, and I know that you're talking about Atlanta, but looking at Florida, each of the DMO, destination marketing organizations, have very robust budgets, and then Visit Florida has an over $100 million budget. Plus, each of the assets in those cities also do marketing. In DC, the only budget that we have is ours, because the Smithsonian doesn't have a budget, and so therefore you all are relying solely on us, and we're going after a larger market share. So we should be spending more because we have a greater opportunity to bring more visitors internationally.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and I was very curious, we're talking dollars and cents here. My other question has to do with whether or not there has been consideration to plummeting the cost of hotel rooms for, let's say, a period of time, 90 days, 6 months, to just see if we can really, up our market. Get the excitement of those who tend to flock to Arlington and other places because it's cheaper. We have the scooters, we have the biking. There's a lot of activity downtown DC now. And I suspect that these individuals that I see are not necessarily staying in our hotels, but they're coming over into DC and enjoying themselves. And so I wondered if we had thought that maybe we'll just try this nice pilot experiment to see if we can lift us up. Just a thought.
Yes. The answer is probably not. And I will say that, if you owned a hotel and you know you could get $300 a night, would you offer it to them for $150 when you know you could get $300? The answer is probably no. And it's a supply and demand and economic game. Hotels are owned by ownership groups. Ownership groups want a return on investment, and that return on investment is tied to demand in those hotel rooms. And if the demand is there, if you try to get a hotel room in December in DC, you probably get a good rate. But if you try to get the same room in March, when the demand is higher, then you're not going to see the same rate structure. So,
well, I'm asking this question because you made a point that incrementally over the last 10 years, we've slowly been rising. And so I'm suggesting look at it from the perspective of rising quickly and seeing then if we can maintain it. Just a thought.
Right, and Councilmember, to reiterate what Ella said, it is a supply and demand issue, but the bottom of the line is a lot of the room rate is tied to the financing of that particular hotel. So the financing model doesn't change just because the market factors have changed. That's still static, and so the hotel has literally been financed upon what their expectation is of daily rate.
Thank you.
If I could just add, we do test things like that all the time at individual hotels. It's obviously illegal to do that in concert with each other.
Yes.
And so we, of course, wouldn't do that, but we do all the time try to see if rate reduction actually overall ROIs, and it almost never does. And one other thing I would just add is that for perspective, the recession in 08 and 09, as a city, we did really well. And it was because we had the government going, strong, and we did really well versus the rest of the country. The pandemic is the exact opposite. And so it's a very different picture for hotels today than it was in 08 and 09.
Thank you,
All right.
Councilmember
Thank
Rogers.
you.
Councilmember Allen?
Thanks. Mr. Ferguson, thanks for walking us through the presentation. I think you make a pretty compelling case as to why we need to be able to budget a bit more and target to help that recovery. I had two questions. One's hopefully quick, and then, well, hopefully both are quick. First is, you've spent a lot of time focusing on the recovery of the international tourism. How would you say DC compares and stacks up to the cities you want to compare us to in terms of their recovery of international tourism?
They are, well, before the pandemic, we still deal with an image issue as a destination. So, you know, when we've traveled internationally, we hear things like people want to come to DC for a day trip, but they want to go somewhere else fine. So we have an image issue as a destination that we continue to focus on, and we've been focusing on it well before the pandemic. After the pandemic, we're not only dealing with domestic cities that are spending more, that already have the panache, if you will, of people wanting to go to Vegas and LA and other destinations, but you also have other global cities that are doing the exact same thing. One of the things that U.S. Travel Association is doing is dealing with visa issues. There's a litany of issues tied to traveling to the U.S. by the global community that they're dealing with. So therefore, as we're looking at that market rebounding, we're also looking at the ease of them being able to come back into the U.S. But those cities that have, like a city like Los Angeles, we have one representative in China, they have 12 offices. So therefore, and clearly with a country that large, you have a better opportunity to engage and influence individuals to fly nonstop to a city like Los Angeles. So we're dealing with the perception of DC as a city that people want to come and stay for a long period of time, and as well as other cities in which we compete against. And the cities I referenced earlier, they're the ones that always have the larger percentage of international visitation compared to us. So we've been focusing on ways in which we can engage that community to come here, because as we talked about during our marketing outlook meeting, once they get here, they wish they had chosen to stay longer. What we would be able to do is influence that on the front end, so that those that are influencing them to visit the District of Columbia will get them to stay longer in the beginning.
Okay, thanks. And then last question. There was some good discussion about the special assessment district, or whatever we're going to call it, special assessment. So according to the DC auditor, Events DC has a $132 million surplus. Did you, or why would we not, turn to Events DC's surplus to identify the necessary funds to increase this versus creating a new assessment, which is then going to be generating the revenue, but is also going to be purportedly going to be having a cost overall?
Well, since
Either one of you are more than welcome to answer.
Since Events DC isn't here to speak to that, there's a difference between, I think, the reserves that are restricted and the ones that are not. And I think the ones that are restricted are still, are the ones that we can't spend because of the CFOs standing next to me or sitting next to me. The bondholders won't allow it to be. So we've spent down a lot, and the council actually has legislation that where the excess goes, and so Events DC is implementing that now. So there's not an unrestricted reserve that is just sitting there for us to spend and push into marketing.
Okay. So reframing that, but correct me if I'm wrong here. You did explore it. You looked to see whether that surplus would meet this need. The answer is no, because it's restricted, and so therefore the assessment is what you think is the right revenue source. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and actually the council explored it before we even explored it, because the council actually dictated where the excess from the restricted to the unrestricted reserve would go. So.
Councilmember, also from an industry standpoint, we think that it's appropriate that we begin to kind of pivot and leverage in what we're kind of framing as a post-COVID environment. You all made a phenomenal investment in the hotel industry. The mayor's vision and leadership through several rounds of grant funding, your vision, your support, and your leadership through several rounds of grant funding to, quite frankly, keep some of our hotels afloat. Now we feel that it's a perfect opportunity for us to begin to invest in ourselves as an industry. So,
great. All right, thank you.
I'm just going to add on the events DC, because some members will recall I became quite familiar with this several years ago. There are restricted and unrestricted reserves. The restricted, as John said, are tied to the bonds. The unrestricted, though, are committed with regard to their capital improvement program. There is a formula that's in the law that it's a ladder that after the monies go through that ladder, what's left over would be excess. So I hope that helps. We have less than an hour left, and we have to talk about public safety.
Absolutely.
Let me just thank you, Mr. Ferguson, and your team.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you very much for that presentation. And before I turn to our public safety update, in listening to the conversation, I think a lot was centered on how do we get back to where we were before the pandemic. And respectfully, I think that we have to think about the future and think differently, because I think the job for Destination DC is different now. Because not only are we asking them to get the visitors back and get back the international traveler, the business traveler, the leisure traveler, we're also asking them to help change the mix of people we have in our downtown. We have to replace workers who may not come back full time, not all of them, not all in every place. So we all have to think about how we're getting a different mix of people. Some of it will be more residential. Some of it will be different employers. But we also must have more people who are coming to visit the city, also for conventions, for sure, but more what we're doing with festivals, more of what we're doing with other entertainment options. So we have to increase the mix of people coming all over DC, but especially in our downtown. So we're counting on Destination DC and Events DC to do the work that they were doing and more. And I think this will help us get there. Now, you know that if anyone comes to me in the hotels, and Destination DC did, to ask for my support of this special assessment. So we are going to kick the tires. We haven't landed on a piece of legislation yet. But we know that our visitors will be coming here. This is not a tax on DC residents. This is not a tax on DC businesses, but this is an assessment that is limited in time that the industry has asked for. So I think we have to give it careful and urgent consideration. The last thing that we want to do is let the other cities get ahead of us in the message and in the marketing. So I am going to look forward to working with you and you, Mr. Chairman, on whatever legislation is required, and making sure that it is carefully written so that there isn't the temptation to extend it beyond its need. Because I think that is what people expect from us as well. So I want to thank you, and thank you for your time here today. But now we're going to turn to the last item on our agenda. We have 45 minutes in our allotted time. We started a little late, so we may go just slightly beyond that for a time check. So we're going to turn to a very urgent issue for all DC residents and businesses, and that's public safety. You'll hear from, as I mentioned, Chief Conti, Linda Harley-Harper, and Delano Hunter. And I'm going to start with the chief.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. While I'm going to give the public safety update, I just kind of want to build on the conversation that we were just having, because I think it's very relevant to what I'm going to be talking about. Everybody at this table are reasonable people, intelligent people, but I just want to put this plug in. I'm a firm believer that different positions promote different perspectives, and different perspectives oftentimes promote diverse responses. So as I listen to the economy stuff and the hotel stuff, and the mayor is talking about thinking differently and we're not extending the tax, these are all reasonable people. I think everybody at the table are reasonable people having these discussions, and again, just offering different perspectives. So as we talk about public safety specifically, and I want to kind of drill down into several areas for you, I want to say at the very front of this that we still have a lot of work to do, period. As a city, we still have a lot of work to do. While there have been some ground gained, I think that it's very important to acknowledge what people feel in community. And that's not just here in Washington, D.C. It's what people feel in Silver Spring, Maryland. It's what people feel in Virginia. It's what people feel in New York and Dallas and Philadelphia and Chicago. It's the feeling that people have of being unsafe, and that has to be acknowledged before I begin to talk about any numbers. You have oftentimes heard me say, one homicide is one too many in any neighborhood. Last night, I'm standing on the scene of a shooting of a 4-year-old child shot in our city. That is unacceptable and really should shock the conscience of community just across the board. And I think we can all agree in that space, regardless of what our perspectives are. I think we can say that that is unacceptable and that's not what we want to see in our city. I think we can also acknowledge that significant investments have been made across the board for alternatives to law enforcement and what we do on our end. You know, Linda Harley Harper and her team and other spaces, other grants that are out there, community-based organizations that are doing tremendous work in this space are doing a lot of things that are out there. And I think that we are seeing the results of some of those efforts. And I like to kind of talk about those things really, because I think it's important really to make sure that we truly have a grasp on where we are. I heard someone recently, you know, speaking at an event, and it was like, yeah, you know, we all know the numbers are skyrocketing. I'm like, that's not where we are. So let's really kind of dig into the numbers a little bit. I'm going to talk about the overall numbers. I'm going to talk about violent crime. I'll go from violent crime to violent gun crime specifically. I'm going to talk about guns. I'm going to talk about juveniles. And I'm going to talk about the results that we are seeing of some of the strategies. So this first slide that's up here, I think it's important as you look at crime to not just talk about where we are right now, and this may be confusing for some folks, but I'm going to break this down for you. If you go to the column in the very far right, people talk about, oh man, you know, this feeling of feeling unsafe. We are comparing in that very far right column 2022, where we are currently, to pre-pandemic year 2019, where we are currently. So if you look at it, certain things will start to really kind of show up. And I'll be, again, talking specifically about gun crime. But when you look at 2022 in comparison to 2019, pre-pandemic, homicides up 17%. Sexual abuse down 28%. Assault with a dangerous weapon down 11%. Robbery down 5%. Overall violent crime compared to pre-pandemic 2019. Overall violent crime down 18%. And then you go through the rest of the categories and you see overall crime compared to pre-pandemic 2019 down 19%. Move up a year. Let's go to the pandemic year, the next column, 2020. Everything is shut down in D.C., our hotels, schools, the whole 9 yards. And you see the homicide number. Comparison to this year, up 3%. Sex abuse, down 15%, 13% for ADWs. Robberies, up 9% for robberies, but overall violent crime down 1%. Going on to the rest of the categories, burglary down 29%. Why? Because everybody is home during the pandemic, so a lot of places not being broken into at that point. You move on further to the motor vehicle thefts, et cetera, overall crime down 2%. You go to year 2021, last year, coming out of the pandemic, or the city is kind of in a state of transition. You look at 2021 in comparison to where we are now. Homicides down 7%. You go on to sexual abuse down 19%. Assault with a dangerous weapon down 15%. Robberies are up 6%. Significant there, and I'll dig into that a little bit further, but I think it's also an interesting point to know. If you go back to the latter part of April into May, we were 48% up in robberies, but significant decreases in robberies. So the increase right now is at 6%, but overall violent crime right now, reduction 5%. And you move on through the rest of the crime categories, you continue to see where we are at a 4% overall reduction in crime. Now, the rest of those categories, you look at the bottom line total crime numbers. Pre-pandemic year, 27,000 crimes in our city. The year of the pandemic, 22.5. Year coming out of the pandemic, 22.9. Here we are right now, and as of today, at about 22,000 crimes overall. So as I talk about the numbers, I kind of just want to use that as the framework to really contextualize the conversation and where we are. This next slide here, January 1st to May 31st, we started off the year in a really, really, really troubling space. Carjackings without young people, carjackings in general, homicides occurring. We were having ADWs, but robberies was also the big ticket item. If you look at January 1st to May 31st, 915 robberies, again, up 41% in that space. There were significant issues going on then. We had to make an adjustment to the strategy that we were deploying. And if you look at June 1st, at a time in the District of Columbia, when crime generally goes through the roof the summer months in the District of Columbia, you know, last year, October was our most violent month last year, with 29 homicides in the month of October. But you start looking at the trend for what happened between June 1st and October 24th. Here's the picture. Violent crime overall down 20%. When you look at homicides from June 1 to October 24th, in comparison to last year, as we were transitioning out of the pandemic, down 17%, ADW down 22%, robbery down 19%, sex abuse down 22%. Very interesting categories as we watch this crime picture. And again, this is something that I look at, that I study every single day. So when I hear the narrative about what's happening with crime and we talk about it, you know, I think it's important to talk about these things in context and where we actually are so that we're all having a conversation really from the same sheet of music. But what is different and where we have to keep our eyes focused is here. What's happening in the space of violent gun crime in our city? This is what scares the hell out of people, right? This is the thing. When you look at how guns are represented in our city, right? And you look at the chart over to the far left, violent gun crime year to date. For while our homicides are down slightly in terms of the firearm being used, you look at ADW where a weapon is used, 778 instances of that, right? A 4% increase. Robberies, look at that number, a 23%. So when people are getting robbed, it's not just snatching of the purse, it's putting a gun in somebody's face and robbing them. And that's what people feel. That's what people fear. That's what they see in communities day in and day out. Sex abuse. In those, while the numbers are not great, 25% represents 10 sexual abuse cases, but if you're one of those victims and a gun was pulled on you to commit that sex act, that's a real thing to you. You move over to the next category and you start to look at gun crimes by ward and where they are. Take a look at Ward 1, where we are there. Okay, we have a slight reduction there. And when you look at Ward 3, a 35% reduction in Ward 3. But look at the rest of the wards and how firearms are showing up in communities all across the District of Columbia. Those are significant. And there's gun data that I'm going to talk about in a second, but the point that I'm making here is that as we look at crime, it's not just looking at crime and saying, oh, we have less crime than what we had the previous year. The crimes that we are having, people are up in the ante. The bad guys are up in the ante and introducing firearms to these different crime scenes that we oftentimes find ourselves responding to. The gunshot victims. When we look at gunshot victims, while there is not a stark difference between where we were last year and where we were this year, you go back to the pre-pandemic year and you look at what the fatal number was as a result of gunshots up to October 23rd, it was 111. This year, as a result of gunshots, we are at 144. I'm telling you that that is as a result of marksmanship. As a result of marksmanship, because any one of those 111 cases, whether it's 2019, or let's go down to the ones that were non-fatal. So if you look at the 457 that were non-fatal in 2019, and you look at the 582 in 2022, a bullet a centimeter to the left, a centimeter to the right could be the difference between a homicide and an ADW. That child last night, that 4-year-old, who's only alive today by the grace of God, a centimeter to the left or the right would have been the difference in that crime scene, I assure you. And we'd be having a different conversation in community about that today, and surely these numbers I think would have increased value as we talk about the loss of a child's life. Where are the guns coming from, you might ask? In our city, everywhere. Look at that. There is not one ward that is not touched as a result of guns that we've recovered so far in the city. 2,761 illegal firearms, a 50% increase over the previous year. Personally made firearms in the District of Columbia, that's the ghost guns. We've recovered 462 ghost guns in our city. That's over 23 over what we recovered last year. Nationally, there have been about 10,000 ghost guns recovered. The other thing that scares the hell out of me, when you talk about these Glock switches, 101 of those recovered last year. Those Glock switches make firearms fully automatic, and I've seen a switch made on a 3D printer over the course of a presentation in about 40 minutes. I've seen a switch made to convert a firearm into a fully automatic firearm. So how does that show up and how does that translate to people being shot on the street? So now when you have the corner where you got 10 guys hanging out and the shooter comes through with a fully automatic firearm and he shoots into that crowd of 10 people, now as opposed to having one person shot, two person shot, now you got 4 people shot. Now you got 5 people shot, which increases the total number of people we see shot in our city. It also increases, when you look at it in terms of the lethality, it keeps that number up there, and that's the reason why I believe in part that we're not seeing huge reductions in that space. When you ask yourself, well, okay, what do these guns look like that we're recovering? That's on any given day. On any given day, these types of firearms are being recovered here in the District of Columbia from people who should not have them, in cars, on crime scenes, in houses, on victims of crime, as well as on suspects. Last night, just last night, that 4-year-old child shot. We had 2 other individuals who were also shot. They were victims. But guess what? They're also suspects. And we placed both of them under arrest. One last night, one today. You know why? Because community video revealed that both of them were shooting. So they're victims, but they're also suspects. And that is consistent with the data that we see when we look at the most recent report that was done by David Muhammad's group that says that on average, our homicide victims and homicide suspects have about 11 arrests prior to the homicide that's occurring, prior to the homicide occurring. So when you are taking this type of firepower from a community, that's why people are scared. And when you have people who are not afraid to use these types of weapons in community, that's the thing that scares people the most. We recently had a shooting in up there in the area of Columbia Heights Village. In the back of that vehicle, one of those long guns recovered. Like, people are riding around the streets of the District of Columbia with those types of firearms. Let me talk about juveniles a little bit. So when we look at this particular chart, we talk about the gunshot wound victims. You look at 20, and this is just as of where we are right now. For homicides, juveniles, we're at about 13 right now so far for the year for juveniles. You look at the homicides or the shootings where there were non-fatal shootings, but a juvenile was involved, 5 of those. And then assault with a dangerous weapon, they're at 62 right now. But again, just kind of looking at 2022 in comparison, that 2 of the crimes we've been able to link to a robbery or something along those lines. It involved a robbery or taking something from the victim. But the grand total at the bottom, in terms of how our juveniles are showing up, the piece that I'm most concerned about is, again, that number involving our juveniles. It's not going in the right direction. You know, we're at 82 total right now crimes involving our juveniles where gunshots are involved, and that's concerning to me. Looking at our juvenile carjacking arrests, you know, we talked about this. I talked about this last year, at the beginning of the year, how our juveniles show up. When we look at the over 100 arrests that have been made for carjacking, our juveniles are represented in 70 of those cases where arrests have been made for carjacking, and that is significant. When we talk about like some of the notable cases, I think it's important just to kind of give community, council members, everybody really a sense of the things that we are seeing. You know, we talked about the case from last night As an example, right now here in the District of Columbia, we still have neighborhoods that are in constant conflict with each other. And I don't have to rattle them all off to you. I can go around to every council member here, and I'm sure, I talk to council member White and others all the time, but we know this community, in this community, they're in conflict. And some stupid thing, some YouTube video that gets dropped, sometimes within the course of an hour, a day, or 2 days, will lead to a homicide. That happened recently over in Ward 5, as an example, down there off of Meigs Place. These things, they happen. So I look at, like right now, as we are strategically focused in with our federal partners on where we focus the resources, I look at the beefs between, just as an example, LaDroit Park, Columbia Heights Village, O Street, as an example, and then, it goes on and on and on, the guys on Kennedy Street and other neighborhoods all across our city, whether it's Woodland or Brentwood, Saratoga, wherever it is, wherever we're having these issues are really the areas that has the attention of the chief of police, and I'm sure our other partners as well. The other thing that we're seeing in this space is that when we formed the carjacking task force, it is true that people who are committing crimes, when you talk about that small group of people, we took down a group of individuals, about, I guess it was 3 individuals, and this was about maybe a few months ago. But Andy Shalal's place, the Bus Boys and Poets, was one of the locations where these guys came in with these type of long guns in an attempt to rob the place. But they didn't just do Andy Shalal's place, right? They hit like several businesses all across the district. They carjacked people. They committed other crimes in the District of Columbia. And when we put this case together, I mean, we're looking at 25 plus cases that these 3 individuals are involved in that impacts public safety, that impacts our day-to-day as we move about our city. So what we're seeing is that as we can be more strategic in that space and focus in on those specific individuals who are doing these types of things that are creating carnage just in our communities, we see the benefit of the results. I believe that when you see a drastic reduction in robberies, again, from 48% in March, April, and then you go down to, we're hovering at 6 and still driving down. The reason for that is I think some of the right people got locked up. That's what I believe. Now, we can say that there are other contributing factors, but I believe that that is one of the contributing factors. Again, I think that we can also say that some of the investments that we're making, that the city is making to help turn around the lives of other people, to help give them other opportunities, I'd like to say that that's also working too, right? I wish that there was a crystal.
Let me jump in for a second,
Yes.
because I want to make sure we get to talk about some of those initiatives, and I know you have it later in your presentation. So if you could spend just a couple of moments talking about the Homicide Reduction Task Force.
Yes, ma'am.
ATV Task Force, Multi-Agency Nightlife Task Force, and then I want to move on to hear about the Gun Violence Prevention Office and the ONE's office.
Got it. So I'll be really quickly with these. So we initiated a couple of things in response to violence that's in our communities. And as the mayor just outlaid, the Homicide Reduction Partnership Initiative, we focused on 4 PSAs in the city, and these PSAs are primarily in Ward 8, in Ward 7, because we saw the greatest amount of homicides there. I'll talk about the number in a second, but essentially what's going on there, we are seeing reductions in violent crime and homicides in 3 of the 4 areas. 1 area is still struggling a little bit. We'll talk about the ATV task force and those other 2 items. So here are the 3 areas that, the 2 of the 3 areas that we're focused on. These are the ones that have had some reductions. Again, over here, and I believe it's 708 is where they've had the increase in homicides. They're up by 5, but their overall violent crime is down by 6%. We're still working on that. With respect to the ATV task force, we talk about, the mayor challenged me back in June. She's like, Chief, we got to do something about these ATVs. And really just trying to arrest people, trying to arrest your way out of it was not beneficial. We launched a different tactic down there, that picture that you see in the far right, and those 2 vehicles right there in the picture to the left are ATV vehicles that we recovered over the course of this initiative. The previous year, we'd only recovered about maybe 12. This year, we recovered over 138 ATV vehicles to make our community safer. People were complaining about that in every quadrant of the city, so we did significant work in that space. In addition to that, one of the things I'm most proud of is the multi-agency nightlife task force. Again, one of the things that we've identified was that our Connecticut Avenue corridor, our U Street corridor, our H Street corridor were areas that we were starting to see upticks in violence. I believe that this is the best of government. Every government agency that is represented there, you see the logos there, and adding to that the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, Adrian Richardson done an excellent job working with us, but we had everybody out there, police officers, cadets, Department of For-Hire Vehicles, DVH, everybody working together, and those are the results over there in the far right-hand corner. And I think what I've heard as a result of this from community members and from council members as well, that the impact is being felt and noticed in the communities that are a part of these areas. Carjacking task force, and I think this is the last slide that I will touch on here. But the carjacking task force, again, these guys were launched to focus in on carjackings. They're making significant strides in their cases. To date, we're at 391 carjackings. Again, we started the year out terrible. That's about 60 over where we were. But so far this year, there have been over 100 arrests made for carjacking, 105 arrests. The majority of those have been juveniles, 70 juveniles, 35 adults.
So with that, Chief, I want to thank you. We do have a summary slide we'll share with the council members about some of the public safety investments that we've made together with MPD, but also across government. If we just show that slide as we move to the next update from Linda Harley-Harper, who is going to talk about the Building Blocks Initiative grants and the Office of Gun Violence Prevention.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to give an update on the Office of Gun Violence Prevention and to talk about the Building Blocks grants. Can everybody hear me okay?
You might want to just move it closer.
So we continue our strong relationship with law enforcement. Our office is focused on non-law enforcement approaches. We have daily communication with MPD and with the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. But we also are taking a whole of government public health approach that all of you have heard. And so certainly in communication with all of the other agencies who have gun violence prevention efforts going on in our city. As you know, the Emergency Operations Center started in January of 2021, and we created an Office of Gun Violence Prevention in January of 2022. And now with the new budget, we are going to be fully staffed with permanent staff by the end of November. And so I'm very excited about that, to have created an Office of Gun Violence Prevention within the Office of the City Administrator. I want to talk about the grants program that has become very popular among our residents. And when I first accepted the position, I attended so many community meetings where I've been so struck by the residents and their commitment to gun violence prevention. And we know that communities know what they need best. And we know that communities know what needs to be addressed in their individual communities. We know that communities have different cultures, and there's no one answer that the government has that we can bring into a community to just stop gun violence. And so the grant program has been very popular, but it's also been very, very rewarding to read the proposals and hear about the proposals and ideas that come from our residents. The Building Blocks grants, we've had, up to this point, we've had two categories. One was mini grants that go up to $5,000 that our residents can apply for without having a nonprofit organization and without having a grant before. And then we had the larger grants that were for nonprofits. To date, we've awarded 137 grants. That covers 6 grant cycles that we've done since about March of 2021. We've had 120 grantees total. That's totaling $1.5 million that's been awarded since March of 2021. We've had connections with over 100 partners who have reached out to us, or we have reached out to them to just support and assist with gun violence prevention efforts in the communities. And that has been extremely successful in terms of finding partners. There's no shortage of residents who want to help. And we know that it's going to take all of us to end gun violence. And so it's really been rewarding to communicate with our residents and to hear from them with creative ideas that perhaps we never thought of about how to impact various communities. I will say, particularly in Wards 7 and 8, which have our communities that are the hardest hit by gun violence over years, that the residents are organized and committed, and they certainly push me to be the very best that I can to make sure that we get the resources and services and supports and opportunities to those residents that need the most. I want to highlight two grantees. One is a mini grantee, Creating Safe Spaces. And it's been amazing also to see what residents can do with $5,000 and how they've been able to really have a huge impact with $5,000. This particular group, Creating Safe Spaces, wanted to create ways for young people to be able to come together to talk about what was going to happen, what needed to happen in their communities, to have trauma-informed groups around preventing gun violence, and to be able to have a space where they could talk about how gun violence was impacting their lives. But they also took that opportunity to help provide cleanups in their neighborhood communities, and had the young people to really see how cleaning their community can also help positively impact their community. So wanted to highlight them. Also wanted to highlight Training Grounds, which, there we go. Training Grounds was a large grantee, and Training Grounds has been a partner with the district for many years, and they applied and were awarded a grant for $137,500. They served over 200 residents with those dollars, and they created a very popular basketball program called Biz and Hoops, where they taught young people about the business of basketball and the various different opportunities that the sport can present. So for those young people who are really, really excited about basketball, they were able to also weave in a basketball business education and leadership workshop into what the young people participated in. And there were nightly basketball tournaments that were focused on the Deanwood and Kenilworth communities. I also learned a lot about esports. They created esports for peace, and they were well-attended tournaments, esports tournaments that Training Grounds was able to facilitate. I want to take this opportunity to talk about the fact that we have a fall cycle of grants that will be coming out before the end of November, and so encouraging residents to check on the Progressive Life Center website, and we'll also be sharing the information. Progressive Life Center continues to be our administrative partner for the grants program, and Progressive Life also provides coaching and help to residents to fill out their grant applications, to not be intimidated by the grant application process. We've really turned this into sort of an educational opportunity for those residents who want to start their own nonprofits, for residents who just need some side-by-side support in completing their application and actually putting their ideas onto paper. And so we've created a very simple application process, particularly for the mini grants, for the residents to be able to simply articulate what it is that they believe their community needs and what they want the outcomes to be. And from that, we've been able to create workshops to also help, and Progressive Life Center has created tutoring videos that are on their website that residents can watch that show from the previous cycles all of the frequently asked questions and things that people want to know to help them to feel comfortable completing their applications. And we also have created network opportunities among all of the 120 grantees, and so we've been meeting monthly with the grantees, inviting all of them to come to the table and to talk about gun violence, to talk about the grants, to talk about what's next. It's interesting to see the grantees show up who were funded several cycles ago, able to share that they got funding from other avenues outside of the government, and so really been a teachable opportunity for all of the grantees, and so really looking forward to continuing the grant process.
So Linda, let me jump in. I want to make sure we get an update on the Office of Neighborhood Safety, from the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. Delano, if you would spend a few minutes so that we can leave ample time for questions.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor Bowser, and good morning to fellow cabinet members and members of the council. I want to thank everybody for their support. I want to echo Chief Conti's comments that we recognize the challenges ahead, and we recognize from one's perspective the important role that violence intervention plays in our public safety ecosystem. I just wanted to note that today is a significant milestone for the office. Today marks our 5th anniversary. Our first day of operations were October 25th of 2017. So again, I just want to thank everybody for the support and the growth of the office during that time frame. We have some exciting news, updates to share that I'm excited about. In FY22, we expanded to 3 new communities, including Congress Park, Shaw, Mount Vernon, and Edgewood. So we now have a total of 25 communities in which we serve. And also, we have a floating mediation team that allows us to have a presence in communities where that aren't considered priority communities. And those are communities like Lincoln, Westmoreland, Riggs, and Sursum Quarters. Also, what's notable about our approach in FY23 is that we have all new community-based organizations doing violence intervention. It's a bit of a different model for us, but we're working directly with practitioners of violence intervention, and we believe that this will yield benefits because it's a more streamlined approach and a more direct approach to doing the VI or violence intervention work. Next slide. Also want to talk about the One's Leadership Academy. We've expanded to 6 schools. If you notice, the 3 new schools on your right-hand side are all feeder schools for the school on the left, and it includes Paul, Kelly Miller, and Kramer. The work of the One's Leadership Academy is anchored in positive reinforcement, redirection, de-escalation, and the mediation of disputes that sometimes manifest in schools. So we're really proud of the work. And this year we anticipate working with over 100 students in each of these locations, or combined rather. And last slide. I wanted to talk about the Pathways program. In the last 2 years, we have doubled the number of cohorts and also the number of graduates. Also, we have expanded the support services and case management that we provide. We're excited about some of our new partnerships and grantees, including 100 fathers, to provide fatherhood mentorship for many of our Pathways ambassadors that are also fathers. So that mentorship has been key. And in the next fiscal year, we anticipate opening a new location in Ward 5 near the Brooklyn Metro Station to be able to provide both Pathways and other important services that sort of skew to the northern end of the city and those that may not feel comfortable coming to our current location, which of course is on 42nd Street. And these are the updates for Ones.
Thank you both. And finally, we're going to close. I'm going to ask Kevin to speak to a bill that the council is considering this week. And I want to thank you in advance, Charles, for the work that you've done with us, the chief and others, on a Herculean task. We know it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make contemporary our criminal code. I think we've made some progress on the issues that are important to us, and we ask for additional consideration on several matters, and I'm going to ask Kevin to cover that.
Sure. So the context of this discussion on public safety is also happening. The context of the discussion on public safety is also happening when we're looking at reforming the criminal code for the first time in decades. And it is important for everyone here and your staff to really read it, make sure you know what's in it. It is, I think I've been told, 10,000 lines long, hundreds of pages long, that covers every facet of our criminal code. And as the mayor mentioned, we've been working with the committee closely to try to resolve as many differences as possible. And I think 95% of the bill, there's consensus for all parties. There are still some areas that we're hoping to make progress on as the bill goes to markup and final vote. One area relates to just changing of sentences that was raised by the chief of police and the U.S. Attorney's Office, particularly around carjacking, robbery, burglary, and carrying a pistol without a license. There are other issues that I think even last night the committee staff and the chief staff are working on, issues that have a really profound practical impact on public safety and quality of life issues really at the neighborhood level, nuisance crimes, public toileting, noise violations that I know folks were working on very recently that we want to be able to work through. And then there are other areas that may be important, valid policy adjustments that are often done, quite frankly, in standalone bills. Whether it's expanding the Second Look Act, looking at jury trials for misdemeanors, and also trying to have dialogue with the committee as to whether or not these in such a large bill would deserve its own public discourse. So I think this week there's going to be a vote. We and the chief staff have really looking through the bill closely. 95% of it is consensus, but there are still some vital things that we're trying to work through with the committee and the council. We look forward to doing that over the next few weeks.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to members for questions, although I have two for starters. One is a copy of the slides. Can we get that?
Yes.
And how will we get that? Will your office, Madam Mayor, or the chief?
Yes, my office.
Okay, if it could be sent to all the members or sent to the secretary who will distribute it to members.
Yes.
The other is just, Chief, I recently had a conversation with the president of the Columbus City Council, and he told me that in Columbus they're following an initiative with ATVs where the chief is actually using helicopters a helicopter to track where those ATVs go. And then later in the day, in a much calmer setting, the ATV is confiscated. Would you have a conversation with the chief of Columbus Police Department and understand that initiative and see if we could do it here?
So I think it's fair to say that people watch the District of Columbia, watch what we do here. We've been doing that, sir, and that's what really accounts for a lot of the 137 ATVs that we have. It's because we found an alternative way to get them off the street when people are not actually on them, but when they are storing them in different places, we can see them. You kind of gave away the strategy, but it's all good.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Councilmember Trayon White, and then Charles Allen, and then I'll pick other people.
So I have a few questions and comments. I'll just try to push through all of them for the sake of time. I do want to note that during the budget cycle, we noted there was $53 million in investment for violence prevention. Still haven't gotten the breakdown to where that went and how that's distributed. So at some point, if I can get that, that'll be helpful for me. The second thing is that I don't think we've completed the model as it relates to the safe passage model. The model was supposed to include individuals not only standing outside the schools to ensure safety after school, but also to be inside the schools. And I've been talking to the administration about this, and we've moved from 0 schools to 3 schools to 6 schools, and that's still not enough. We've seen there were over 14 shootings this year at schools or around schools, and we're going to see more if we don't be proactive about this. So 6 schools is not enough, in my opinion. I think one of the greatest things we've had is of pathways. That was a part of Councilman McDuffie's bill to the NEAR Act, and now this evolved to People of Promise. For those who don't know, those are some of the highest risk individuals that the government has captured and worked with over the years. I want to overemphasize it's very important that we have a pathway for them to get careers, and the one's office have done a tremendous job of that, but there are some who are not. Okay, there it is. Yes, thank you. So I was explaining the need to ensure that we connect these young individuals who are high profile, considered some of the highest violent offenders in D.C. to our resources and jobs. That's critically as important. We had a meeting with them a few weeks ago in which they gave presentations about a business opportunity they wanted to do that was around eliminating rats in Washington, D.C. As a city, we should absolutely support that. They have a fine business model, a plan that these young men have come up with that we should be supporting, not just for jobs, but also entrepreneurship opportunities. And we do have a serious rat problem in D.C., but that's another topic. Sunday morning, I left the hospital around 5:30 a.m. for a young man who was shot. He was 18 years old. This was his second time being shot. He got shot when he was 14, then again 18. And we're seeing, I know the numbers reflect that you said that juvenile crimes are not going in the right direction, but there are a number of juveniles that's involved in and around schools and school-aged children. So we got to hop on that. And finally, we're seeing an increased number of ambulatory services needed. As the chief mentioned, somebody with these switches and automatic weapons is leaving several victims on the ground, and it's a delayed time in getting ambulances there to the location to get the individuals up into emergency care, which leading to more fatalities. And so I know we are paying for 2 ambulatory services, not sure how they're coordinating, but that's a big issue when I arrive at crime scenes, getting these individuals care with so many people are getting shot in the district. So I will digress there and look for some feedback from these comments and questions. Thank you.
In response?
Council member, I'll sort of to start. First of all, we'll make sure today we get you the budget breakdown of all the allocations for last year and this year, as well as the expenditures that you mentioned. In regarding Safe Passage, we have talked about evolving that program, which we have expanded greatly over the past 2 years, expanding it to also include a integration of being outside and inside the schools. We do have a presence inside some schools that Director Hunter mentioned, but that is an area that we want to further evolve the program. It will require, between now and putting it into the budget, really close collaboration with school leaders who have to be very comfortable knowing who's in their school and what their role is, and that is something I think we can do, but there's some delicacy, and it will take the ability to really map out what that model looks like so it's effective. On the EMS question, I'm going to, after this meeting, just look into some of the EMS response times, in particular in areas that we have multiple victims. You're right, we have for many years now had supplementary ambulance service so that we can supplement what FEF EMS is able to do with AMR, and I'll sort of look at the response times, and I'll have Director Hunter talk about pathways.
Thank you, got that. Yeah, so wanted to Councilmember, to your comment about connecting the pathway ambassadors and various program participants to opportunities. There is one notable one I wanted to provide through the mayor's expansion of the seasonal leaf opportunities. We targeted 50 young men, 40 of which were considered people of promise that are being onboarded now, that are training as we speak, and with life skills and other job training, and they're scheduled to start within the next 2 weeks. And these are actually term employment with benefits. So we're really proud of that, and I think that speaks to your point about providing those sort of opportunities for those participants. And we want to do more of that. Also, we have, of course, our subsidized employment, but also we're connecting Pathways participants to vocational training and other support services as they seek to better themselves in their communities.
Thank you. Councilmember Allen?
Thanks. I appreciate it. I know we're right at 11, so I'll try to be fairly brief, because I assume we got more questions as well. Let me just briefly touch on the RCCA, the Revised Criminal Code, and then I had one or two questions. I appreciate your comments, Ms. Mayor. Also, to the partners around the table, because it has been a deeply collaborative process. For anybody who has not been paying the very close attention to the RCCA, we're talking about updating D.C.'s criminal code for the first time in 120 years. It was written in 1901 and imposed on us by Congress. It's outdated, it's contradictory, it's a mess, and after a 16-year-long process, we now have a revised criminal code in front of us. It is the representation of a lot of compromise, collaboration, stakeholders that normally are adversarial, as it is natural in the criminal justice space, that all came to the table together to work on moving a package forward, and it represents that. I will note, just because, Kevin, as you were talking about the issue that, Ms. Mayor, you highlighted around those public nuisance issues, working with MPD, and thanks, Chief, with your team, we have a solution for those that'll be a part of what gets moved tomorrow that addresses those concerns. So I believe, again, that spirit of collaboration, working together here to get a package that is going to move forward. In terms of the other real meat of what the update was, I really appreciate the three of you being here. One of the things that you've heard me talk about a lot is that our solutions have got to be both and, not either or, and I think you all sitting here together really represents and illustrates the both and. So I'm grateful for that. And Chief, really appreciate you walking through the stats as well, and you and I talk about this all the time. The stats tell a story, but on one hand, we always say it with a caveat, because if a robbery just happened to you or a carjacking happened on your block, crime just went up. And so we recognize that. I think, though, the way you illustrated the difference between the first half of the year and the second half of the year, in particular around robberies, and we talked about this at the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, but I think it could be beneficial for everybody here as well, around the strategic approaches taken. I think which also lays out in the gun recoveries, 50, almost a doubling of the guns being recovered. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little about your perspective of the partnership with USAO, MPD strategies, courts, et cetera, around being able to drive that change that we've seen reflected now in the number, especially the first half versus second half when it comes to robberies.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councilmember. And just as an acknowledgement, you know, I think last night we got on the phone about 11:30, 11:40, and before that I was in a different time zone. It was probably 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. So I certainly have an appreciation for the spirit of collaboration to try to really work on the issues that we still differ on. Again, I think reasonable people can disagree on various things. With respect to what we've done in terms of our strategy, we are making a more intentional use and a more focused use of our collaboration with our federal partners on various cases. For example, I'll just use this to highlight one of the things that we did. So as you think differently about how you fight crime, you see a bad guy, and this bad guy who's a felon who shouldn't be in possession of a firearm. However, he's going to Virginia and he's on camera practicing at the range. He's still a felon in possession of a firearm. So we've been able to work with our federal partners to bring charges strategically in cases like that, where people, felon in possession, are, you know, those cases are essentially going over to federal court and people are being held accountable in that space. Same thing with like robbery, for example, and some of the other crimes that we see where people are using handguns, coupled with the commission or coupled with the distribution of narcotics. Enhanced penalties in those spaces when we charge in different venues. So the collaboration with our federal partners is really starting to pay dividends. And as we focus on that, again, I think between June and October, when we generally see the things going through the roof, we've seen dramatic decreases in that space, and we want to continue doing that through the year.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, just one other, I know the colleagues have questions. So quickly. Question. Director Hunter, I know you've been pulling double duty as head of DPR and the ONES office, so just a quick public appreciation for your leadership stepping in there, and that's, I know, been a challenge here. We've got another Pathways cohort about to graduate next week, I believe, which I think this may be our 11th class.
The fourth. The 11th cohort, forgive me.
11th cohort, yeah.
That's right.
And just, again, I think you've done an incredible job of stepping in. Are there any updates you can share about the search for the next director for the ONES office and continuing the good work taking place there?
Well, that's for me to answer.
Or to the mayor.
And we, as noticed earlier today, I will begin making appointments in some offices where we have vacancies. And so we're working through that process. As I mentioned, we are accepting applications for leadership, policy prevention, policy positions, and frontline positions. So interested people should go to Mayor.dc.gov or careers.dc.gov.
Thank you, Councilmember Allen. Councilmember Robert White, and let me see, I have Councilmember Nadeau after that. Who's George Pinto?
But, Mr. Chairman, before you move on, I just wanted to, and I appreciate, Charles, I hadn't gotten the word that one of our areas of particular interest had been addressed, but we still are concerned about some of the weakening of penalties for gun crimes and other serious violent crimes. So I hope that we'll have your attention to that. And I also just wanted to emphasize a bit here my concerns about the court's capacity to deal with all misdemeanor cases. And so you include in your proposal making all misdemeanors eligible for jury trials, which they aren't currently. And while I don't have a particular issue with having trials, I do have an issue with making sure we have the judges and capacity to deal with trials. Because if we don't, even in 4 years or 3 years when this goes into effect, that just gums up the whole system for our criminal cases, for all cases. And we should all be paying attention to that. So if you could just continue to focus on those concerns, we would appreciate it.
Absolutely. If I can very quickly then just make sure I address the jury demandability. So again, for everybody, in the 1990s, it used to be in D.C. that if you were facing a misdemeanor, you had a right to a jury trial. In the 1990s, they took that away. And so the district is an outlier in this case. There's only 9 other states like the district where if you're facing incarceration of up to 180 days, you don't have the right to a jury. The RCCA proposal, which is what came from that body that brought it to the council, recommended that we go back to the way we had it, which is where you get to have a jury of your peers. It's kind of a foundational legal principle. And they recommended we make that change wholesale in about 1 year. Working with the courts, working with a lot of stakeholders, I don't think that's a reasonable expectation that that could be achieved within 1 year. So what the RCCA that the committee will be moving forward proposes is delaying that for 3 years to allow our courts to get ready, have multiple phases in all the way through 2030 to then work through how we actually make this work and be successful so people have that right. I think you and I share a concern, of course, around the structural deficit, as it were, that we'll always have in terms of making sure that we have judges at Superior Court, since we are dependent upon a White House and a Senate to move our judges forward in a way that no other jurisdiction has to face. And that is something we have to make sure we're paying very close attention to, collectively advocating to make sure we get our judges. But it's also why the proposals change to give a lot more time to be able to allow that adjustment and phase in of the right for jury trials.
I'm going to try to keep us moving along. It's almost 11:10. We were supposed to end at 11. There, I believe I have 4 more council members on the list here. Councilmember Robert White, I think you're next.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and to your team. I wanted to start with the violence interrupters. The auditor released a report in June that suggested, among other things, that the auditor's office felt that the violence interrupters were spread too thin. And I would appreciate your thoughts on that. And also when and how we start measuring the work in progress of violence interrupters for the purpose of continuing to improve as we go.
Both good questions, and Delano, let me ask you to talk to, I think that we attempt to address having violence interrupters in more places across the district, and we will continue to do that. And we can talk a little bit more about how we're measuring, which is something that we've all kind of wrestled with. What are the best metrics to follow?
Sure. Thank you, Council Member. Two important notes. Recently, we've increased our collaboration with the violence intervention groups under the purview of the Attorney General offices. of the Attorney General's office, rather, and that has been successful. Specifically with our outreach to people of promise. They have a reach sometimes in communities that we don't have a presence in. So that's been important. That level of coordination has been important. And also I would add, as it relates to how we measure, of course, we're going to look at the incidence of violent crime, homicides, assault with deadly weapons within our priority communities. That's one measurement. But one of the things about the One's office is that we have a person-based strategy. So we are closely monitoring the individuals that we work with. And one of the things that we look at is their attainment of employment, their attainment of housing, their ability to access certain services, whether it's workforce development, education, mental and behavioral health. Those are things that we closely look at. And we're constantly evaluating, are we working with the right people? So, of course, studies like, People of Promise is important, but also the information that we receive from our violence interrupters, many of which are in those communities, they're known commodities. They know who are the right people that we should be working with, primarily those influencers. Those are things that we're constantly looking at.
I appreciate it. I know what to measure and how to measure it is difficult. I think it's important that we measure things even if they change over time. With the understanding that increases in crime is only one indicator. If crime goes up, we don't say, well, we don't need MPD anymore. We say, what do we do differently? And so I think for that purpose. And my last question, just for the sake of time, and I should have started with an immense thank you to the Chief, Director Harper, Director Hunter. You and your teams are doing a lot of work, and it's noticed, and I think the stats show that we're moving in a good direction, but as the Chief said, one crime is too many, and we still have to keep moving. There are a lot of agencies at the table, as it should be. The One's office, OVSJG, MPD, DBH, OAG, a lot of agencies, and then a lot of community-based organizations as well. How how's the Office of Gun Violence Prevention coordinating all these efforts to make sure they're all focused on the same things and working in coordination?
So that's probably been one of the biggest challenges, right? But we are certainly continuing our work in this space. The community partners, we have various different networking groups that we've been working with around coordination, as well as doing the same thing with the agencies. We are right now planning to meet with all of the deputy mayors and the agency leads around FY23. And our continued coordination around for this fiscal year and what we're going to be doing around making sure that our investments are well spent in this space.
I appreciate that. I'll just note well, I'll bring this up to you later, Mayor.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Nadeau.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor, and to the team here today for your presentation. Just a couple things. One, first of all, we would love the basketball and business program in Ward 1. So please bring it. One question for the chief, actually two. I'm going to just ask all my questions and they'll let you guys answer all together, okay? So first is with the violent crime numbers, where does unlawful discharge or sounds of gunshots fall in there, which is, I think, really your point about marksmanship ties into that, because that's just in my mind, someone missed, right? But is also very scary for neighborhoods. Two, the carjacking numbers look like they're way up this year, and wondering if there's a why behind that you guys have dialed into. And then third, Director Hunter and I have been talking about this, but very abruptly at the end of the fiscal year, we lost the partner for violence interruption in wards 1 through 4. And there's been sort of a temp sub situation, which is a challenge because they aren't necessarily folks who know our turf as well. The chief spoke in his presentation very specifically about some crews, and I will not name them again, that are in conflict right now. They've been in conflict over the past 2 days. They've been in conflict over the past 2 weeks. They've been in conflict very heavily since that contract fell out. And I'm just hoping there might be some updates on where we are with all of that, because it's very clear the relationship between the conflict mediation services that we have and the work that MPD is then having to do on the back end. So those are the three questions: carjacking, unlawful discharge, and updates on the VI programs for wards 1 through 4. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member. So regarding the violent crime numbers in terms of where does unlawful discharge of a firearm show up, so you will not see it represented in the slide presentation. I will note, however, that through the Criminal Code Reform Commission, one of the changes that's included in there, which is something I certainly support, is that if you unlawfully discharge a firearm in the District of Columbia, I think it's a 2-year felony. I want to say 2-year felony is what the threshold will be for that. So that's an increase from where we are right now, and I think that that's something that enhances public safety. When you talk about the carjacking numbers and why they're up, the primary reason is if you go back to the month of January, February, March, or months January through March, is when we had really the big uptick in carjackings. Those numbers, while we still have had them, they've tapered off as we've kind of moved through the year, but the increase is really represented at the very beginning of the year, where January, February, March were just terrible months for robberies, which included a lot of carjackings there, but the numbers have started to taper off.
Thank you, Councilmember. Last week we had an opportunity to brief Councilmember Lewis George with the interim violence intervention CBO within wards 1 and 4 that are operating in both communities, and I think we have something scheduled in the process of scheduling with your office. While the transition of that organization was something that was unexpected, I do think that it presents an opportunity to work, closely with new practitioners that bring new ideas and new ways of doing things. But also, it allows us to sort of expand our footprint in addition to those 3 priority communities in Ward 1, and also the priority communities in Ward 4 through the engagement of what we call navigators. We're able to expand that reach. So, for instance, we're in the final stages of bringing on board a new navigator in Ricks Park, which, of course, is embroiled in conflict with communities in Ward 1. So I would say that interim solution is something that we do have some faith in. We think it'll yield results. As it relates to the formal solicitation, our commitment remains to have that posted and open to the public for competition in early December with the eye towards bringing on board a full-time contractor by April 1st for the second half of FY23.
Thank you. And I wanted to also just thank Mayor Bowser for the Nightlife Task Force on U Street. I think it's a really great illustration of how important other agencies beyond MPD are to the solution, right? Because, I mean, all those partners out there taking stuff off your plate, Chief, to really get at some of the underlying issues. And, it just shows you a road closure here, towing a vehicle there, it can really make a difference. So I'm looking forward to working with you, Mayor. Thank you for your commitment to helping me with my U Street Safety Initiative. And I hope we can keep those task force going as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Pinto.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all very much. And as I'm sure you all see and hear every day, public safety continues to be far and away the #1 issue that I hear from residents every day. And so thank you all for your work and leadership in trying to implement some new strategies to address this. I want to align myself with Councilor Trayon White and some of his concerns raised around safe passage and also the specifics of the budget around the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. I think when it was initially set up, $15 million was put in and then an additional $59 million. And as I look at the presentation, we talked about some of the wonderful grant work going on that I think you said totaled $1.5 million. And so definitely would like to see what else the money is being spent on. Because we have such a great opportunity here today with some of our public safety leaders and some of our greatest hospitality leaders, an industry in which we're seeing a great shortage in jobs. How can the hospitality industry be helpful in employing some of our young people who need additional supports and opportunities that you're working with?
Well, we're certainly interested. Always looking for placements for our pathway graduates, so we'd love to have a conversation with you all afterwards. Thank you.
I think I'll just add that a lot of what Director Hunter referenced earlier were placements that are within the government for Pathways graduates. And so if there's an opportunity to call on the business community at this point to say, we also need you to grab up and consider the Pathways graduates for employment after they have gone through a completely amazing transformation that you can see. I think that's definitely something that we would be more than happy to engage with.
Mr. Keene, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, we can certainly follow up on that. We have a myriad of programs that we currently run. We serve a high school, which are hospitality specific academies, but as you know, we're not different than any other industry. We are hungry. So we will certainly
And Solomon, if you could just highlight some of the shortages that the hotels are seeing. I know you are seeing some shortages in housekeeping and all of those. So if you have that off the top, that may be helpful. Okay.
Thank you. We're experiencing shortages across the entire board, even all the way up to the management level, where we saw somewhat of an exodus during the pandemic, where folks with management expertise and experience were moving on to other markets that were a bit more active at the time. But no different than any other industry, we're experiencing shortages at the line level throughout the entire operation. It's not something that's unique to us here in the district. The hospitality industry, particularly in certain sectors, pre-COVID, our biggest issue was dealing with an aging workforce. Quite frankly, some of those folks just made the decision that they're not coming back, and they won't be coming back. So we're actively about the business of deciding how to best replace those folks and hopefully replace them with candidates that will be with the industry for the long term.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm concerned about time because it's 11:22 and there's still several council members. Councilmember Lewis George.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Madam Mayor, Chief Conti, and to all of the partners here. And thank you, Mayor Bowser and Chief Conti, for being out last night on Kennedy Street, as well as Director Harley Harper, who was also present on Kennedy Street after the two individuals were shot, but a 4-year-old boy was grazed on the chin by a bullet. I want to frame my questions in the form of, can we work together on this in some of the particular locations? Kennedy Street, as you know, Mayor Bowser, when you were Ward 4 council member, when we grew up here in this community, for those of us who've grown up here, Kennedy Street has always been sort of a problem area. The location where the young boy was shot last night is the block where I grew up on Kennedy Street, 2nd and Kennedy as my home. So the trauma from dealing with the same shootings all these years later on that block is, it hurts as a person who has dealt with that trauma and lived in that neighborhood. What I think we need to do in Kennedy and what I think we can work together on Kennedy Street is, obviously, we have programs on the ground. We have ones on the ground, and while we're in the interim, we'll work together on that. And I'm hopeful we'll be able to get a new contractor up. Kennedy Street is also deemed an opportunity zone, as we know, for the purposes of development. But I think we can bring opportunity to Kennedy Street, right? Not just in the form of development, but I would like to see us take some space on Kennedy Street. There are a number of vacant locations, right? We have 501 Kennedy Street, which is the old Johnny's Carryout that has been vacant for a long time. We have the Starlight sort of location where we get most of our violence on 5th and Kennedy. I think that's an opportunity for us to bring government services to Kennedy Street. In the frame of, we can bring a library. Director Gavilan's here. We can bring a government services like the Employment Services Center, like the American Job Center to 5th and Kennedy. We could allow a brick and mortar opportunity for the one's office to actually be able to set up the new violence interrupter, whoever we use. We could have them be located in that new location in addition to the Pathways program. So what I would like to see is an opportunity for us to eminent domain property, potentially on 5th and Kennedy. There's a number of 5th and Kennedy properties, I think, ripe for eminent domain, where we can bring government services to the Kennedy Street corridor. I think Kennedy needs opportunity. It is an opportunity zone. While we have developers, reaping the benefits of being able to develop properties there, I think we have the ability to also bring opportunity there. So my ask is, if we can work together, identify what government services would be best suited there, whether it's a job center, whether it's pathways, whether it's a library, or, there are other agencies here that we can work with, but I want to see an opportunity brought to Kennedy Street. And I want us to work together to do that, because I think it would be really powerful for us to do that for the Kennedy Street community, and a real testament to what we want to do there. So that's my first ask. That's the biggest ask. Obviously, it requires a lot of moving parts, but I do think there's the opportunity to eminent domain and build there. There's a number of just small asks there on Kennedy Street. We need to remove the art structure on 5th and Kennedy as well. It has been graffitied. It has been utilized for the storage of guns and drugs. Myself, 4th District, has made that request. It has not been removed. We would like that removed. Kennedy Street is also suffering from a high number of vacant and blighted properties that don't face the necessary level of enforcement or abatement. These properties, many are owned by the same company, or I think from what I was talking last night, they are just sitting on those properties and have been sitting on them for a number of years, almost 8 years, especially on that 400 block of Kennedy, but they own properties from 1st and Kennedy all the way to 7th. And so if I could get your help with agencies, whether enforcement, abatement, Office of Tax and Revenue, whoever it is, those individuals need to come off those properties. If they're not going to develop them and create retail or housing, then they need to be removed. So I'm going to ask for support in getting that to happen. The other piece of it, I think that is important for Kennedy as well, is really just making sure when we know, I think the issue is that we know the members of, when we talk about the crews, we don't want to name the crews, but we know who the individuals of the crews are. We know where they stand every day on 5th and Kennedy or 7th and Kennedy. And so for community members, it just feels like they're being able to exist and persist. And I guess I want to understand why they are allowed to continue to persist and exist there. Everybody else has done, I believe, their parts from the main streets. We do programming on Kennedy Street every week. If there's a new program on Kennedy every week where we bring the kids out, the businesses have been supportive. But I want to understand why, if we know who the crew members are, it's a small number of people committing the majority of the crime, why we can't have those individuals removed or given the services or whatever is necessary. Many of them don't even live in D.C. anymore. A lot of them don't live in the area. So I just want to understand why we allow them to persist and exist further. The other area, Petworth Metro, I will be with Councilmember Nadeau at 2 o'clock. We'll be with WMATA GM, and we will be with, I think, 4th District and our violence interruption teams, both on the Cure and one side at Petworth Metro. After that conversation, we'll have some things that we want to see come out of it, and we hope that we can have your support and coordination with those things at the metro area. And then lastly, 14th and Spring is the other area. All of our crime and warfare is concentrated in those 3 areas: Petworth Metro Station, Kennedy Street, and 14th and Spring. On 14th and Spring, we've gotten a lot of help. Thank you to DBH, who has come out and supported at that corner. We've gotten a lot of help. DPW came out and has removed some of the gang tagging or graffiti. There is still vacant and blighted property over there. What used to be Carolina's Restaurant, which has sat there for a long time. I've made requests either to have DCRA put up fencing around that area where we keep finding drug paraphernalia, and we haven't been able to get that fencing put up, or Tax and Revenue or DCRA to once again get somebody to come up off that property. If you're not going to do anything with it, if you're not going to develop it into a small business, our Uptown Main Street is amazing and booming and does great work. I would like to see them do something there. So I would like the coordination from those partners on the 14th and Spring side to help us deal with those 3 issues. So I'm really coming to you in partnership saying we have 3 locations: Kennedy Street, 14th and Spring, Petworth, majority of the crime is existing. I think we can be partners there. I think we can bring opportunity there, and I think we can solve these crimes, the violence there really easily through coordination. And I want to thank the One's office for the work they have been doing on the ground on Kennedy Street for all these years. And I know when we get a new service provider, they're going to continue to do that work. But even putting a brick and mortar there would help them be able to do that. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I'm concerned about time. It's now 11:30. Councilmember McDuffie.
I wondered, can we get a response?
Yeah, if I could just jump in, Chairman. Yes, first of all, to partnership, I appreciate your assessment. I think I largely agree with what you said. I won't take a lot of time talking about my experience with Kennedy Street over almost 17 years. But I will say, and every chief of police that I've ever worked with knows that Kennedy Street is the bright line for Ward 4. It dictates just about every public safety matter that exists in the ward. I know what's happening because of what's happening on Kennedy Street. You saw your numbers were up 25%. That's unacceptable, and a lot of it is driven there. You asked, why don't we just remove people from the corner? Well, we can't just tell people that they can't stand somewhere if they're not committing a crime while we're there. I think you know that. But that's why MPD and others will do a lot of long-term investigations. Some you'll know about, some you won't, in trying to identify people that we know are involved in crime. I shared with you, we believe that there's probably one or several people that were involved in 4 shootings 2 weeks ago. We want to arrest them, but the police, as you know, have to build a case. And so we can't just say that we think you did it, so therefore we're not. In other cases, there was a 15-year-old child killed in the city a couple of weeks ago. We've identified the other juveniles involved. We have to build a case and take that to the AG's office. So all of those, I don't want to give anybody the impression that if they see people standing on the corner that we know they shouldn't just be standing there. They're probably not just trading, recipes. And so we are always trying to identify ways to do that. We do think that we have the opportunity with this revision to make clear that a person can say you can't stand in front of my house or in front of my business and give MPD the ability to move them along. So I hope that you'll pay attention to that during this revision. The last thing I wanted to mention is certainly we want enforcement of vacant and blighted properties, but I just want to make clear, because I think there's this misperception that the DCRA or now DOB or the chief financial officer can't make a vacant building a populated building. They can make sure that the tax, all of the vacant property taxes and things are being properly enforced, and they can ensure that the building, if it is vacant, is secure. So this fencing and boarding up issues that you talked about are important. So their role is to make sure that the building is being properly taxed and secured, and our role collectively is to make sure that people are interested to even moving in a vacant residential building once it's available, or similarly for commercial property. So let us, Kevin and council member, talk about your 3 priority areas and how we can be supportive.
Thank you. Councilman McDuffie.
I'll keep my remarks really brief and maybe try to keep it in the form of a comment so we can get out of here. But I just wanted to note the agenda, I think, was perfect because it touched on 2 extraordinarily important things, which is our city's economic development and economic growth, particularly coming out of the pandemic, and public safety. And I think a more concentrated focus on the intersection between public safety and our economic growth is appropriate as we continue to try to make sure we're recovering equitably. I want to say, and I'd like to be able to follow up with the folks on the public safety side, seeing more collaboration and consistency as I have over time. I want to thank you all for doing that, even between ONES and the Office of Gun Violence Prevention and the Cure the Streets programs on the OAG side. I'd like to see more when it comes to training across the board, collaboration, and maybe even consistency around contracting and compensation between the folks who are doing the work. I think sometimes they're looking at each other, wondering why somebody's making less or why somebody has a longer contract, which I think is also important. And then I'll just say data sharing, what it looks like between the two programs and where they're being implemented. Coordinating with MPD, where we're seeing some of these initiatives that appear to be reducing some of the violence. Do we have these programs there already? I'd be interested to know if there's something there. And then finally, I'll say thank you just for all your work. I appreciate all that you all are doing to trying to keep our city safe. I look forward to the continued collaboration. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Madam Mayor, you're hosting. This is for you to.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank
close
you
down.
for the topics were important and had a lot of information, so I appreciate everybody taking a little bit extra time, and we will continue to follow up on the good work that our public safety team is doing and driving the numbers in the right direction, and we recognize that there is more work to do. So thank you.